What's up, Badger fans? I think this is going to be a really fun show. I want to talk about the best of the Paul Chryst era, the best wins, the best recruits, my favorite moments. I think there's a lot of good nostalgia here that we should rehash. Let's get into that on today's Locked On Badgers. Let's go.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Really do appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Herrings. Today's show is brought to you by our new friends over at FanDuel. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOnBadgers today to get started. All right. So listen, I think this has been inevitable, right? There's been a lot of piling on of Paul Chryst with Luke Fickell coming on board and everything he's done, this recruiting typhoon of right, like talent and this media blitz and new coach energy, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, be excited for it. Absolutely. I am very excited. I can't believe football's like 7 months away. I'm gonna have to go into like a self-induced coma to survive that period of stressful anxiety and waiting. However, there's been the side effect of that again, and I think it's been inevitable, has been a lot of piling on of Paul Chryst and the recent downturn, some of the late failures. And listen, I'm sure I've inadvertently piled on as well at times without really trying to. I say a lot that I'm not trying to dance on Paul Chryst's grave. I released a show after he was fired, the thank you show for everything he's done. But I do think it gets lost some of the really good moments. I kind of wanted to step back and look at the nostalgia of really a lot of good moments with Paul Chryst. And our good friend Deputy over on the Discord recommended something like this. I thought it was a great idea. So hats off to you, Deputy. I am rocking the USS Badger hat today. Really interesting side note. Somebody in the comments chimed in at one point and said, "Hey, I was on that ship," which I think is just awesome. This was a frigate decommed in the 90s. So I thought that was a really cool thing. So hats off to everybody who's on the show that may have been on the USS Badger. I think that's phenomenal. But let's get into it. So the first one here is, and these are just my lists. Feel free to let me know where your list would be. These lists are not the right lists necessarily. They're just my opinions. But I wanted to rank my favorite games of the Paul Chryst era, like my best wins. And I'm going to start here. Let's see. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I got my top 6 wins of the Paul Chryst era. And this is going to be a trip down nostalgia lane, which I think is good. Like, there were a lot of good moments with Paul Chryst, and I want to celebrate some of that today. I feel like I'm in a good mood. I feel like sharing some joy. And the first one is the 21 game against Iowa. Iowa was 10-4 that year. I mean, that was a good Iowa team. The rivalry is always important. It's always nice to beat Iowa and Minnesota. And Wisconsin jumped all over them, up 20-0. They could do nothing. Iowa had no semblance of offense. Again, that was a good Iowa team, a ranked Iowa team, if I remember. Herbig had 2.5 sacks. The defense had 6 overall, just suffocated them. Again, they were up 20-0. I think Iowa scored right at the end of that one, but that was a lot of fun. Always good to beat Iowa. Number 5, I've got the 2019 Michigan game, and I almost had this one higher. There's just a couple bowl games that I had a little bit ticked up, but this game was awesome, right? If you remember, go back to 2019, that Michigan team was supposed to be really good. When Wisconsin played them, that Michigan team was ranked 11th in the country. They were ranked higher than the Badgers, and Michigan got throttled. If you remember that game, the final score was 35-14, but Wisconsin was up 35-0, right? And then Michigan scored some garbage points. They kept their starters on. They all scored like one more garbage point, but Zach Baun, I think, forced a fumble. But regardless, they throttled that freaking team. Shea Patterson, the defense had 6 sacks. JT ran for over 200 yards. And it was just one of those games where it felt like the Wisconsin brand and the Wisconsin physicality was still too much for Jim Harbaugh, for that vaunted, go blue, that power brand. Wisconsin just took it to him and destroyed him. It was so much fun. Screw Michigan, quite frankly. Arrogant fan base and team. And now, of course, Michigan came back the next year and whooped us, but that 2019 Michigan game was a ton of fun, and the defense was just all over him from the jump. All right, let's go to number 4. I've got the 2016 Cotton Bowl. That's where he played Western Michigan. Everybody knows who the coach of Western Michigan was, PJ Fleck. Always nice to get an early win before he started his Gophers career against the Fleckster. That was a 24-16 game. It's a little lower than it probably should be. Like, the Cotton Bowl's a big bowl, especially then the Cotton Bowl it's a BCS level bowl. That was a reward for having a great season. Eastern Michigan or Western Michigan, sorry, was undefeated up until they played the Badgers. They were 13-0 at that point. They had NFL talent both at the offensive line and at receiver. Corey Davis was on that team. It was a really good non-Power 5 team, but you don't get as much credit ever for beating a really good non-Power 5 team, right? And it makes the bowl game feel a little anticlimactic. I thought the Badgers let Western Michigan back in that game as well, but you still won a Cotton Bowl. You beat an undefeated team. That's a really good win, a lot of fun. There was so much hype and momentum inside the program at that point from both a fan standpoint, from a program standpoint. It really felt like Paul Chryst was establishing his identity. And in the moment, that was a huge win to cap off a really good season. All right, and number 3, you got to go back to Minnesota, right? At number 3, we got the 2019 Minnesota game. That was, again, if you remember, that was both teams were 10-2, right? We were fighting for the Big Ten West. If Minnesota wins that, they go to the Big Ten championship game. If we win it, we do. And there's a lot of hype in that game. Minnesota's ranked 8th in the college football playoffs. I don't know if anybody remembers that. And then Wisconsin just destroyed them. Right. There's all this hype from the Minnesota side. This is our year to get there. And Wisconsin just beat them down. It was like 38-17. Jack Cohn was awesome that game, 15-22 with 2 touchdowns. And at one point, the camera panned over the Minnesota sideline, and it looked like Luke Fickell was looking for a lifeboat, right? Like all hope, abandoned all hope. That game was over. Wisconsin dominated that day in a game that both sides had to have. That wasn't a throwaway game. They also got the axe back. Like Minnesota had the axe in the previous year. They kind of paraded it around the state. Chris Orr had an awesome quote. He went on a diatribe about Chris Orr, legendary Badger. I'll put it up here. He said, "We felt like they disrespected the axe, but I guess I understand they hadn't had it for a while." There were classes of Minnesota football players that had never seen the axe. So Chris Orr went on to say, they only knew what it looked like by Googling it. So, yeah, classic quote there. The Badgers completely took them apart. And obviously, this led to the all-time great moment where PJ Fleck created a ring celebrating their co-Big Ten West championship, even though we beat them in the head-to-head. Like they put that on a ring and celebrated it, which really shows you again the differences between where these two programs, not just in that era, lay, but really overall. Like their standards and what they're celebrating is far less than what we would never do that. Let's just be real. Wisconsin is not making. If you lose that game, Wisconsin's not celebrating that with the ring. That was an all-time ridiculous job from PJ Fleck. You lost the game, bro. You didn't win the West. Stop it. I love that game. That game will always be one of the highlights for me in the Paul Chryst era because you beat Minnesota, you beat Fleck, you denied them their bowl game, and then you got on top of it the dose of PJ Fleck ridiculousness where he's still somehow spinning that into a win for them. That's awesome. All right, number 2. Let's get it. 2017 Orange Bowl. A lot of people are going to say this should be number 1. But I'll get to my number 1 and why it's number 1 for me. Again, this is just my list. Let me know what yours is. This is not necessarily the correct list. This is just mine. So 2017 Orange Bowl game, that great team, great defense. If they had only come through in that Big Ten championship game against Ohio State, before, but you still, again, Orange Bowl. You talk about Cotton Bowl, a prestigious bowl. The Orange Bowl is an incredibly prestigious bowl. You go down into Miami's backyard. You beat them up. Again, the game ended up being a little closer than I thought it should have been. It was 31-24. Alex Hornibrook had the greatest game of his life. 4 touchdowns. A.J. Taylor and Danny Davis dominated that game. Davis had 3 touchdowns. A.J. Taylor had 130 yards. And just a dominant, I shouldn't say dominant, but a really impressive Wisconsin offensive win against a very good Miami team. And really, again, at the end of that, you had won the Cotton Bowl in 16, the Orange Bowl in 17, and you really feel like this program is on the precipice of doing things that we all dreamed it could. Now, we know what happened after that, but Paul Chryst had him right there knocking on the door. And those 2 bowl wins were incredibly big, incredibly prestigious, big moments for the program for sure. And then my number 1 game, it's the 2016 opener, LSU, Wisconsin, Lambeau. I understand in the big picture, this probably doesn't mean as much as winning the Orange Bowl. It probably doesn't mean as much as smashing Michigan or smashing Minnesota. It's an out-of-conference game. But 2 things. The first is that setting was unbelievable. I was at that game, which biases me, right? I was there. And that setting and that environment was awesome. There were a ton of LSU fans there. There were a ton of Badger fans there. It was such a fun environment to be in. And that LSU game, even though that LSU team kind of fell apart, that LSU team was loaded with talent. They came in with a ton of hype. And Wisconsin kind of derailed their season before it got started. Teams can kind of fold before they get going, right? and Wisconsin punched him in the mouth. I'll always remember Leonard Fournette getting the opening kickoff, and he was the incredible 5-star running back that was going to dominate everybody, and they just shut him up. Leo Musso had like an open field tackle on him at one point. Ryan Connolly had an open field tackle on him on a screenplay. That was a huge moment in that game. Frankly, that game was only close because Bart Houston, I think it's Houston, threw 2 interceptions, one of which was a pick 6 for LSU. Wisconsin was the better team all day, dominated the line of scrimmage, and just such a big, fun moment against a powerhouse SEC team. Paul Chryst in the beginning of his tenure, Lambeau Field. Yeah, so that's my number one. Let me know where you guys have. Maybe I'm missing a game that you guys would have in that top 5 or 6 for Paul Chryst, but those are my top 6 Paul Chryst wins of his tenure. All a lot of fun, rivals, bowl games, big SEC opponent. Really, really enjoy those. All right, coming up, I'm going to talk about my favorite players of the Paul Chryst era, the favorite recruits that he landed. I'm going to talk about that next on Lockdown Badgers. But first, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It is our new sportsbook partner. Is America's #1 sportsbook, and we're excited to get this going. We're really excited about our sports because it's the Super Bowl. FanDuel, if you're new to FanDuel, it's even better. They have so many great features that make it easy for betting on sports, make it really simple to get started. And if you download the FanDuel app now, you can bet on Super Bowl 57 with the no sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads and who will score a touchdown. And I've talked about some of my favorite bets. Now that I can no longer ride my Niners to the Super Bowl, that was a tough one for me. But I've talked about, I was looking at college football futures on FanDuel. Colorado over 4.5 wins. I'm going to bet the new coach hype there, bringing in a bunch of transfers. I think that's going to hit. And Wisconsin plus 10,000 to win the national title. I'm probably going to put like $5 on that because why not? Right? I'm all in on Luke Fickell, Mordecai, the schedule. I think, yeah, why not? That's a fun one for me as well. The FanDuel Sportsbook is safe, secure, super easy to use, and best of all, you get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. And when you're done, go check out the Locked On is heading to the Senior Bowl. Get inside analysis from the hosts that cover the NFL's next stars. Find out which NFL boards these players are rising on and which ones they're climbing on, all in one location. Subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft for nightly live shows from the Senior Bowl on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 p.m. All right, I want to get back into this. Really appreciate everybody tuning in as we build this community up. Y'all are amazing and awesome, and that's why we do it. Let's talk about my 5 favorite players from the Paul Chryst era. And to preface this, these are players that were recruited by Paul Chryst. So I'm not taking any of the players because there were some great ones that he inherited from Gary Anderson. I mean, low key, Gary Anderson recruited some real dudes. Like, I know he gets a lot of hate. I know there's a lot of animosity when you bring up that name, and he would have driven the program into the ground like the Edmund Fitzgerald hitting the bottom of Lake Superior. But I'm telling you, you can't deny that he recruited some real dudes that Paul Chryst won a lot of games with. So none of those players are applicable to this list. For this list, only players that Paul Chryst recruited, that he got into the program, are going to be on this list. So let me give you some of my honorable mentions, and then let me know again, this isn't necessarily the right list. This is just my list. So let me know who your favorite players of the Paul Chryst era are. And these aren't necessarily the best players. These are my favorites. I think I'm going to do a list of the best players as well. And we'll maybe make that a community show and get some voting in there. So these are some of my honorable mentions. You got Alexander Smith, Matt Henningsen, Jack Sanborn, Chimre, Braylon, Quintus Cephus, Tyler Biadish, Tippmann, Keanu Benton. There's some dudes there, right, that Paul Chryst brought in. I mean, again, just looking at that honorable mention list, I love Chimre Dike. I love Alexander Smith. Alexander Smith was one of the lowest rated recruits in that class, and he's developed into just a stud corner. Matt Henningsen, you talk about an underappreciated dude. I love Joe Tippmann. You're talking about a future NFL center. Keanu Benton, just a 4-year starter, just a total dude. And one of those players that the Wisconsin staff, Paul Chryst, really did a great job of unearthing, right? Not a highly recruited kid, someone who came in, though, and became one of the stars of this Wisconsin program. So another player there that I really, really enjoyed his time in Madison. He's going to be missed. All right, let's get into my top 5. My top 5 favorite players of the Paul Chryst era. Number 5 is Jake Ferguson, Barry's grandson. Just a fixture for 4 years. And despite having a a bad passing ecosystem around him, despite really having very little depth for the last couple of years in the tight end room that could spell him or give him a break. Despite all of that, for 4 years, that dude just came in and balled out, right? 145 catches, 1,600 yards, 13 touchdowns. And without him, where would the tight ends have been the last couple of years? I, like the last couple of years he was there, I should say. Where would the tight ends have been? Because there was nobody else on that roster, right? We were praying for health, and all along it's just Ferguson that kept it together. So Jake Ferguson, Barry's grandson. Yeah, loved his story, loved his game. Number 4, Ryan Ramczyk. And Rams really only had a year in Wisconsin. I just love his story. I don't know how you can be a sports fan and not love this type of story, right? A kid who went to Winona State and then left, and then went to a community college, and then was there for like a semester, and then went to Wisconsin Stevens Point, played there for like 10 games. And then Paul Chryst gets the job. He transfers in, comes in as a walk-on, and then he just becomes the best left tackle in the Big Ten and one of the best in the country, right? That's such an incredible fairy tale journey for a guy who is now in the NFL, was a first-round pick. And, Paul Chryst brought him in. He reached out to Paul Chryst, obviously, developed behind the scenes for a year. We heard the whispers all year. He had to sit out, but we heard like, hey, this is the next dude. And then next year, he was just a dominant left tackle. I love the stories like that. So, yeah, Ryan Ramczyk is number 4 for me. Number 3, Zach Baun. Now, some people may point out that Zach Baun came in the recruiting class that Gary Anderson, that was his last year, Gary Anderson, but Paul Chryst took over that recruiting class and brought Zach Baun in, if I remember correctly. Like, Zach Baun wasn't in that group, and then Paul Chryst came in, re-emphasized in-state recruiting, got Zach Baun in the door. I think Alec Ingold as well was part of that group that Paul Chryst kind of brought back in. Zach Baun was incredible. Let me know in the comments if there was another Badger with a better get off the line of scrimmage, off the edge, in Zach Baun. His senior year, 12.5 sacks. He had 19.5 tackles for loss. He was incredible off the line of scrimmage. Like, there were plays where he was almost not touched by the left tackle because he was so explosive. 3rd-round pick of the Saints. The NFL career didn't really develop quite as much as we had thought it might. But his last year, that 2019 season in Wisconsin, he was one of the dominant edge players in the country, not just the Big Ten, and one of the great linebackers in this stretch of linebacker play at Wisconsin. He could also play in space. He would blow up screens, just a terror off the edge. I loved watching Zach Baun play. Number 2, let's talk another linebacker here. Leo Chanel, right? Death row on the arm, on the bicep, and magic marker. He missed a couple games that 21 season, and then when he came back, it was a locomotive, right? 18.5 tackles for loss, 115 tackles in general, 8 sacks. Part of being a sports fan, and I talk about this a lot, part of being a sports fan is, enjoying what you're watching, getting excited to see certain players, right? We all want our team to win, but we also want our team to win and provide excitement, to show us things that we haven't seen, to do things on a football field or on a baseball field or a basketball court, whatever it is that we just can't do in real life. Like, that's why we're drawn to sports. That's why we're drawn to these elite athletes. And Leo Chanel is like the apex predator of that group, right? I'll never forget them, Jim Leonard, and that group putting Leo Chanel in the middle of that Army offense, right? The triple option. And they just lined him up over center. And he just took that offense apart. Like, they had no answer. You can tell Army might have game planned for teams doing that, but they just never ran into a Leo Chanel because he just took them apart. There was a play he almost took the snap from the Army quarterback. He was just such a freak show athletically that it was so much fun to watch. One of the greatest things to watch is Leo Chanel blitzing up the A gap and taking on a fullback in the backfield and ending his day. Like, he was so much fun, man. So Leo Chanel's number 2 on my list, just for the pure entertainment value. Obviously, incredibly productive as well. Had that running mate with Sanborn, who's in my honorable mentions. Another great linebacker coming in under this regime. And then number 1, it's got to be JT, right? Number 1 favorite player of the Paul Chryst class, Johnathan Taylor, coming in as that high 3-star running back out of New Jersey. What more can you say about him, right? 6,100 yards, over 6,100 yards, 3 incredible seasons, starts as a true freshman, one of the best running backs in the NFL, 6.7 per clip. I mean, get out of here. Absolutely incredible running back. Great find by Wisconsin, staying on him. And then they put him in a great place for him. Like, we can laugh all we want about the lack of the passing game, and maybe that hindered the ceiling, right? Obviously. But this is still an offense that Johnathan Taylor put up roughly 2,000 yards a season in. So Paul Chryst and the staff did something right here. And these players were just incredibly fun to watch. Again, my top 5 of the Paul Chryst era players that he recruited or helped bring in: Johnathan Taylor, Leo Chanel, Zach Baun, Ryan Ramczyk, Jake Ferguson. Let me know on your list who I should have had in there. If I missed somebody that you think should be in there, or just somebody that you like more. But there are a lot of studs that came through these doors with under Paul Chryst and that staff. I think we'd be remiss to miss that. All right, coming up, a couple of my favorite moments of the Paul Chryst era. I think everybody knows one of them, or maybe my favorite things that he did. I think, again, everybody knows one of them that's coming up, but I got a couple more. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick word from our friends at the show. All right, I want to thank everybody for tuning into Locked On Badgers again. Really, really, really do appreciate y'all. Let's continue this kind of Paul Chryst nostalgia avenue tour. And again, we can be super excited about Luke Fickell. I am, like we all should be, while also saying, there were some really good moments in that Chryst era, and I'm happy to have seen those. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm done. Even when I say at times I get a little critical of Chryst, I say I'm not trying to dance on the grave, because I'm really not. But I think I'm even done with that. It's all Fickell now, and the Chryst stuff was overall really good, and that's where I'm at. So let's talk about some of my favorite moments. This first one is, I think everybody knows one of these is an obvious one with Chryst. But I'm going to go back to the beginning of his tenure. These are favorite moments or best things he did. I kind of wrapped this all together. Retaining Dave Aranda. Now, at the time, people said, well, that was a no-brainer. I'm telling you, a lot of coaches come in with ego, and they bring in their own DC. A lot of coaches come in with, I don't want to say an agenda, but they don't want any ties to the previous staff because they have this thing inside of them that wants all the credit. They want to build it all themselves. They think they have all the best ideas. And listen, heck of a lot of credit to Paul Chryst for keeping Aranda, for saying, no, this is the best DC I'm going to find. We're going to keep him. We're going to keep his system. I'll be hands off. And that really laid the foundation and the bedrock of what that Badger defense would do for the next 6-7 years, right? Keeping that foundation in place. So I don't think Chryst gets enough credit for that, because too many coaches have a need, almost a psychotic need to rock the boat, right? To have control over everything, to have every guy one of their guys. And Chryst at times did that. It undid him towards the end, the Al Johnson type hires. But this is the opposite of that. Dave Aranda was an incredible hire, or incredible keep. And it really stabilized Wisconsin and allowed them to flourish into that elite defense over the next 5 or 6 years. My next one is that Mertz moment, right? Mertz, not the career we expected, but you remember that first start, right, against Illinois. First of all, give credit to Paul Chryst and that staff for securing Mertz, one of the highest rated recruits ever. Fought off every blue blood you could think of to keep him, so they got him in. And there's that first Illinois game, the season starting, and he goes 20-21 with 5 touchdowns. Everyone's head explodes. Patrick Mahomes is tweeting about a Badgers quarterback. I mean, think about how much has changed, how much changed over the next couple of years from that moment, where we thought it would go to where it ended up going. I mean, we thought we had a Heisman type talent at quarterback that was going to bring Wisconsin to the next level. And it just never did. But that moment itself, if you just go back and be in that moment, was incredible. I remember listening to podcasts after the show. People were losing their minds. The Solid Verbal, which is one of my favorite podcasts, was losing their minds. Wisconsin's got a quarterback. Watch the frick out rest of the country. It was such a fun moment. It didn't last, but in that moment, I'll always I really enjoyed it. It was so cool to see. My next one is, and this is the one that I think everybody knew was coming, the turnover chain comment. So you go back to that Orange Bowl game, right, where they beat Miami. Miami obviously had the turnover chain, all the swag you could think of, all the chains you can think of. And, the camera just perfectly pans to Paul Chryst, right, mumbling under his breath. Chris Herring's right next to him. He's just like, turnover chain, I can't say it on this show. This is a family-friendly show, but everybody who's watching this knows it. What a great encapsulating Paul Chryst moment, right? Understated, under his breath. He wasn't trying to bring attention to it, but he's also that old school guy that he heard about the hype, the Miami turnover chain, and he just shut them up. And he's just like, oh, come on, turnover chain, I'll always remember that moment. And it's just a hysterical, funny, awesome, encapsulation of who Paul Chryst was, the best of Paul Chryst. So those are some of my, again, let me know in the comments if I'm missing a moment you really appreciated about Paul Chryst, or a favorite player, or a best game, or anything, right? This is just a good vibes Paul Chryst nostalgia show. And I think we had a I think we've moved on into a healthy new relationship with Luke Fickell that I think is going to be incredible. And I think because of that, we can look back at Paul Chryst and be really good with it because there was a lot good there. Again, thank you, Deputy, on the Discord for throwing this idea out there. I thought it was a really good one, so I ran with it, but I definitely want to give you credit for that. On Wisconsin, and let's keep talking. A bunch more coming up this week. We got recruiting talk. We got a couple new guests, or at least one new guest that I can think of. So a lot coming up this week for sure. Really do appreciate everybody tuning in on Wisconsin, and let's keep it going.